Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you so very much for our presently engaged in a years-long study of the 5 books, the Pentateuch, working through these 5 books week by week according to the annual cycle of readings, also known as the annual Torah cycle. Today's class is built around or based on, at least in part, the Torah reading, as it's called, Bo. And it runs the material I'll be talking about, plus or minus verses on either side. The material that consists, or Bo consists of material found in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 1, all the way through chapter 13 and verse 16. This particular reading is called Bo because it begins with the phrase Bo el Paro, Bo el Paro, which means go to Pharaoh. Go to Pharaoh. This is a command from God to Moses, and that is exactly what happens. So Bo, the Hebrew word Bo, is typically translated as go. Now, while I'm talking about Hebrew and translating, just hit me that I forgot to announce. I've mentioned it in the bulletin. I've talked about it on Facebook, that in the very near future, I will begin again a very basic course in learning to read Hebrew. This is not an advanced course, so if you're already to the point where you know the letters, you know the sounds of the signs, you know the vowel points, if you're beyond that, then you might want to check into our Hebrew Torah reading team and jump in, and you can begin at that level. But this is for that person. If this is you, look at me. If you're that person who has always wanted to learn to read biblical Hebrew, to begin the journey, then this is going to be the class for you. I intend to go slowly. Some of you might have already passed this point in your skill level, but you might want to come back for a refresher. I remember when I was first learning from books, and I would look at the chart of letters, and the transliteration of the letter names even threw me. I was like, is this Aleph or Aleph, or how do you pronounce that? We're going to go through all that. You're going to get the proper pronunciation with, and this comes free, a Southern accent. So you're going to get that Southern, by the time it's over, you'll all speak proper English like I do. So you'll get that. But anyway, seriously, I'm looking forward to this because I remember how difficult it was to get started. And I want you to get this. Now, as far as grammar, we're not getting into that at this point. We may do something later, but I find it very helpful to get people at least in the door with the Hebrew language. We'll go with this. We might the classes might only be 30 minutes once a week, but I'll give you assignments to go do on your own time, all right? But anyway, that's coming. My intention is to start those no later than the first week of February, but I'll settle all that as I look at my calendar for February, and we'll let you know. Also, by way of announcements, don't forget that this coming Sunday at 7 p.m., Hanok Young is on his stateside tour. He's a longtime friend of United Israel, and he will be speaking here at the United Israel Center South in St. Francisville. If you're within driving distance and you want to come in person, we already have a few people who've contacted me and let me know they'll be here, but I highly encourage you to do that. Come, and would love to have you here to hear Hanok. If you cannot come, you live somewhere it's too far, you just don't want to make the trip, whatever, we will be live streaming, just like you're watching me now, on our Facebook channel and our YouTube channel, or our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. So no one has to miss it, but we'd love to see you in person. All right, so Bo means go. As the name suggests, the material that we plan to cover today is a continuation of the confrontation that we started last week. A continuation of the confrontation, a great confrontation between, on one side, you have Moses and Aaron and the Hebrew God Jehovah. Now that's a strong team. On the other side, you also have a strong team. Not as strong as the one I just named, but it's just consisting of Pharaoh, his people, at least the bad ones, those who are opposed to the children of Israel, and the gods of Egypt. So it's a great contest between these two clashing cultures and so forth. Now, last week I mentioned that there is a view put forward by Hofmeyr, who is a biblical scholar, Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar, Hofmeyr. He puts forward this view that the plagues, the blows that are aimed at Egypt are not so much a direct attack against Egypt's gods, but they're an attack against what is called, it's a concept in Egyptian called ma'at. Ma'at, and I talked about it last week. Ma'at is sort of it's hard to define, but you can define the concept. The concept is one of order. So ma'at consists of not only the cosmic order, but social order as well. So if you have bad things going on in your society, it's indicative of a lack of control in terms of ma'at. If you have frogs dying and hopping into your houses by the thousands, fish dying, water turning to blood, hail killing all your cattle, that is a sign, ladies and gentlemen, that the Pharaoh, though he has the charge to do so, to control ma'at, it is a clear and direct sign that he is not in control. So Hofmeyr and others have signed up for this, have suggested that the plagues let everybody know that the Pharaoh, he might have a nice relief painted on the wall of a temple showing the goddess Ma'at being presented to the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon, and it might say in writing, I've got this. Egyptians want to claim that they have control of it, but it's clear when these plagues start coming that he's lost all control. Now, many have suggested that at least in part, the plagues are a demonstration in our narrative. In other words, our narrative is demonstrating by these plagues that a defeat of Egypt's gods by the power of Jehovah is what's really going on. So the idea that Jehovah, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and Aaron, and the children of Israel, has unleashed all chaos on the gods of Egypt. Now, this idea does indeed have support from several texts, at least in a general way. We have a couple of passages that indicate, contra Hofmeyr's view, that what's going on with the plagues is an attack on the gods of Egypt. Go with me this morning, first thing, to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12, and this puts us into the reading material for today. You'll see that I'm not going verse by verse this week, but I'll be covering some major points from this reading. Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, "For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt. Ani Jehovah, I am Jehovah." So now this is God describing what he is going to do. He's going to strike down all the firstborn in Egypt, and in doing so, he's ultimately unleashing how's it put, mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt. Now, go with me to the book of Numbers. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. We're going to be doing this quite a bit in our present study, but go with me to Bamidbar, in the wilderness, the book of Numbers, chapter 33. By the way, I love the title Bamidbar as opposed to Numbers. You know, when you pick up the book of Numbers and you begin reading, there's no better name than Numbers for the book of Numbers, except that the real core of the story is the wilderness tradition. So that's where we're going to be focused, and that is the Hebrew name of the book. Look at Numbers chapter 33 and verse 4. The Egyptians, meanwhile, were burying those among them whom Jehovah had struck down, every firstborn, whereby Jehovah executed judgment on their gods. So we at least have two strong passages which support the idea that the plagues demonstrate a defeat of Egypt's gods by the power of Jehovah, right? So this is the idea. Now, there's no doubt that God can have multiple purposes in His actions, so that Hoffmeyer could be right. The people of the day might have been talking in their houses and saying, hey, look, Pharaoh so-and-so does not have control over Ma'at. I don't care what the relief in the temple says. He has lost all control. People have always made fun of politicians, right? So he's clearly taking a hit on his approval rating at this point. On every channel in Egypt, by the way, everyone is saying that he's doing poorly. Now, by the way, we're going to come back to Bamidbar 33. We're going to be using Numbers 33 quite a bit in our present study because this particular chapter, let's look at verses 1 through 3 just to let you see why we'll be there. These were the marches of the Israelites who started out from the land of Egypt, troop by troop, in charge of Moses and Aaron. Moses recorded the starting points of their various marches as directed by Jehovah. By the way, in Hebrew, that's al-pi Yehovah, according to the mouth of Jehovah. Their marches by starting points were as follows. They set out from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. It was on the morrow of the Passover offering that the Israelites started out defiantly in plain view, says the writer, of all the Egyptians. So we're going to be looking at Numbers 33 quite a bit because one of the things that I want to do is bring you, my dear friends, on a literary journey. And this journey is going to involve a horizontal study of the marches in the wilderness. We want to, when I say horizontal, some of you know this, most people read the Bible from book, you just take it book by book, you read Genesis all the way to the bottom, then you go to Exodus all the way to the bottom, and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. What I want to do is I want to say, if Numbers chapter 33 says that they began their journey in Ramesses and went to Sukkot, that's what I want to find in Exodus. If Exodus gives me material, I want to look at it. Is this what this says? It's a check. So you read text side by side. New Testament scholars do this with the Gospels. Very few people have had the wherewithal or the common sense, I might say, to look at the Torah this way. You know, people are scared to dig in and look. Not us. We're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to look at this very, very closely in our horizontal study. Now, the question becomes, what can we learn from such a study? I think you will be surprised. We'll see. That's coming. So welcome. This is class number 16 in our current ongoing series, the Pentateuch, A New Look. It is class number 3 in the rolling cycle in the book of Exodus. So we're in Torah reading Bo, which is the third reading. Now, it is in this reading that we conclude the 10 plagues. Well, let me say it this way. The plagues, just without a number. According to Exodus, there are 10. They go from chapter 7, verse 1 through chapter 12, verse 36. There are 10 plagues. You can count them, 1 through 10. But we have two other texts in the Bible which describe this confrontation, which describe this plagues, or these plagues. They are poetic in nature, you might say. So some might argue that the intention of the writer is not to get an exact measure or number of the plagues, but if we look at these other two texts, and we're going to be doing this off and on, there are 8 plagues according to Psalm 78. Psalm 78 is a psalm of Asaph. The 8 plagues of Psalm 78 are listed in verse 12 and then verse 42 through 51. But if you go to Psalm 105, which is another psalm which deals with, at least in part, the plagues of Egypt, it only gives us 7. And those are found in verses 23 through 26 of Psalm 105 and verse 27 and 28. Now, what I want to focus on today is not every plague, not every blow by blow that is put forward against Egypt. But I want to focus at least most of my time on Exodus's, apostrophe S or apostrophe as the case might be, the 10th plague, the slaying of the firstborn. And there's a reason I want to focus on that one. We're going to get to that. So the first thing I want to do this morning, since we do have 3 accounts of the plague. By the way, the death of the firstborn appears in Exodus, it appears in Psalm 78, and it appears in Psalm 105. So this one is not one that's missing in Psalm 78 and Psalm 105. This one is consistent in all 3 of our sources. So go with me this morning to Psalm 78. We're going to talk a little bit about this 10th plague, Psalm 78, and I want to read a part of this. I want to pick up in verse 49, Psalm 78, verse 49. He inflicted his burning anger upon them, wrath, indignation, trouble, a band of deadly messengers. He cleared a path for his anger. He did not stop short of slaying them, but gave them over to pestilence. He struck every firstborn in Egypt, the first fruits of their vigor in the tents of Ham. All right. So Psalm 78 tells us that God's anger is inflicted upon the tents of Ham. Tents of Ham is the way it's actually pronounced. But the idea is that he does this, according to this translation, in Psalm 78, verse 49, a band of deadly messengers. A band of deadly messengers. Interesting. The ASV says a band of angels of evil. A band of angels of evil. All right. King James says by sending evil angels among them. And the ESV says a company of destroying angels. So how does God kill all the firstborn? By the way, it's all the firstborn human, all the firstborn animals. If a person or an animal is the first one to open and pass through the womb of its mother, according to the plague, number 10 in Exodus, and number 8 in Psalm 78, and number 7 in Psalm 105, that one dies. Every one of them. Now the Hebrew that's translated all those things that I just gave you is Mishlachot Malachei Ra'im. Now Ra'im is evil ones. It's plural. Bad ones. So these are some bad Malachei Ra'im. What is Malachei? Malach is translated variously. It means messenger, but sometimes these messengers, as we know from the biblical text, are from another realm. You could call them angels. That's the word that we typically use. But I don't know exactly what you envision in your mind when you say angel. Is it a cute little chubby cherub? Is it something of that nature? Or is it something else? Is it a beautiful woman with a flowing dress? Is it, what do we have here? Well, get all of those images out of your mind right now, because whatever these messengers are, these Malachei Ra'im, according to Psalm 78, they're going through and they are killing the firstborn. Now, Mishlachot, in that word, Hebrew is built, this isn't a Hebrew lesson, but Hebrew is built on a root, and the root of this is shalach, to send, but it's a noun. So it's represented in these things that I sent you. King James pretty much nails it. I love this. King James says, by sending, well, I almost love it, but by sending evil angels among them. In order to make the syntax work for the King James translator, they had to add among them. Among them isn't there. And by sending puts it in a different form of grammar. It should be a sending of evil angels or evil messengers. The tents of Ham. Okay, now go with me. Hold those thoughts. I know your minds are racing. Go to Psalm 105. And at Psalm 105, we're going to see what this psalmist says about this particular plague. Let's look at verse 26. He sent his servant Moses and Aaron, whom he had chosen, and they performed his signs, among them his wonders against the land of Ham. Interesting. Now I want you to go down to verse 28, and I'm just going to give you this for your notes. I'm not going to read it. Verse 28 through 34 give you the plagues. The number that Psalm 105 gives us, those are all recounted here, and Psalm 105 gives us 7 plagues. But then verse 36 of Psalm 105 says this: He struck down every firstborn in the land, the first fruit of their vigor. Let me tell you something. Psalm 78:51 sounds very similar to Psalm 105 verse 36. Those are almost exactly. So as I was preparing my study for today, I looked at them, and I looked at them in the Hebrew, and there are a couple of very slight differences between the two. But there are several Hebrew words consecutively where it's almost an exact match. It tells me, this is what I see. The writer of Psalm 78, it's attributed to Asaph, and the writer of Psalm 105, which does not have a heading to tell us who wrote it, though there are various speculations, whoever wrote these two, I believe, are relying on a single source. They're looking at something because they're almost word for word. Again, I use gospel studies. People might be saying, well, I thought this was a Torah study. Relax. I'm talking from a text-critical standpoint. Scholars of the Gospels will look at text and they will compare what Matthew says versus what Mark says and what Luke says, and they'll determine what is the source here. This one's in agreement with this one and so forth. I do that with the Hebrew Bible. It's called critical text studies. And you want to do this. You want to try to determine what the source said. Now, the differences are, it's he struck all the firstborn. That says the same in Psalm 78 and Psalm 105. But then it says, in Psalm 105, it says, in their land. Psalm 78 says, in Egypt. So other than that, one says in Egypt, one says in their land. Same meaning, it's interpretive, right? But they're looking at the same source. He struck down all chol bachor, all the firstborn. And then Psalm 105 says, let's see, let me look at it in English. That is verse 36. The first fruit of their vigor. That's the way it's translated. Psalm 78 doesn't say all their vigor. It just says their vigor, if you're going to translate it vigor. Okay. So the idea is that both of these writers are looking at the same source. Now, this brings up an interesting observation. Specifically, when we're comparing the accounts within the Hebrew Bible. Generally, even though the accounts vary in their details, you see a little bit different here and a little bit different there, we do have some points in common. So again, our main point in common is that the death of the firstborn occurs in all three sources that we rely on to tell us about this plague of the firstborn. Exodus, Psalm 78, and Psalm 105. All of these contain the death of the firstborn. They don't all contain the plague of darkness. Interesting. That's a big deal. The whole land is dark for 3 days. You'd think that would make everybody's list. But all of these plagues don't occur in every one, but this one does. That's why I want to focus on it. Now, I want you to go with me this morning back to Exodus, back to Shemot, the book of names, which is reluctant to give us those names quite often. But go with me to Exodus chapter 4. And I want to tell you, before I get you to the right verse, that according to our narratives, put an S on there, this takes place. What I'm about to tell you takes place before Moses and or Aaron appears before Pharaoh. So this, what we're about to read, is something that God tells Moses to tell Pharaoh, so it happens before his first visit to the throne. All right? Now look at verse 21, chapter 4, verse 21. And Jehovah said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the marvels that I have put within your power. I, however, will stiffen his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says Jehovah. By the way, again, if you didn't catch this a couple of weeks back, this is the first occurrence of Ko Amar Yehovah, thus says Jehovah. It appears a lot in the Hebrew Bible. This is the first time. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, Ko Amar Yehovah, thus says Jehovah, Israel is my firstborn son. I have said to you, let my son go that he may worship me, yet you refuse to let him go. Now I will slay your firstborn son. Now, remember, this happens, according to the chronology, before he ever goes to Pharaoh. But God is saying here, or the writer, I should say, is saying here, I've said to you, let my son go. You hadn't let him go. The question is, has he already told Pharaoh to let the people go? No, that's a question for another class. Now I want you to look at, though this is slightly out of order, look at right before this. I want to pick up in verse 19. The Lord, Jehovah, said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who sought to kill you are dead. So Moses took his wife and sons, mounted them on an ass, and went back to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God with him. But he didn't go back to the land of Egypt yet. Stick with me on this. I'm not picking at the text. I'm pulling it open so that we can discover some things. It says he loaded up the donkeys, wife and kids, and they went back to Egypt. They did not go back to Egypt yet because the next verse says, when you return to Egypt, he's not there yet, and you perform before Pharaoh all the miracles and all. So this happens in Midian. This word happens in Midian. While he's in Midian, but before he returns to Egypt, obviously, he's told, when you do go back, and after you perform these signs and wonders, what's he talking about? The plagues. You say, well, he could be talking about his tricks where he does the staff into the snake and reach your hand in the bosom and those kind of things. But it could be, he's like, after these blows, after these wonders are enacted, then I want you to tell Pharaoh, see, now it makes sense. Now he's going to say, I've told you to let my son go. You didn't let him go. Now I'm going to kill your firstborn. You follow? See how I expose a textual difficulty, but then I explain it. So he's not getting ahead of himself. God is giving him a chronology, criteria which must be met. Don't just walk in day one and say, hey, Pharaoh, if you don't let God's firstborn son, he's going to kill all your firstborns. Hold. Don't tell him that yet. Hold. You're going to wait until you perform the signs and wonders. He refuses. Then you're going to hit him with this one. Everybody follow? All right. So that's what happens. Now it says, God says, I, however, will stiffen his heart. You know, and the old argument is, how fair is that? You know, did poor Pharaoh even have a chance? I mean, my goodness, God hardened his heart. He had no choice. You know, what's fair about that? You know, and then the other side says, who are you to question God? Now, here's what's going on, though. And I brought this up last week. 5 texts. He's saying here, I will stiffen. I will make it harder. I will take what he has done himself and give him more of it. You want to harden your heart? I'll fix it where there's no turning back. I'll give you the desires of your heart. How many people have ever heard that phrase? You know, Lord, give me the desires of my heart. Well, you better make sure your heart's pure before you ask that, right? So this is kind of the same thing. Remember, the Egyptians are real big on this idea of measuring the heart at death. After I taught the class last week, I noticed that the Torah.com, which I love, most of their stuff, I think those guys are listening to my classes because it just so happened that the next week they put out an article. You saw it, didn't you? And I saw it. That the next week they put out one about what I talked about last week, about the heart of Pharaoh and how Anubis brings the dead person before this tribunal, before the court of the 2 ways of Ma'at, and the heart is placed on a scale, that your heart is weighed against a feather. And if your heart outweighs the feather, a monster eats the heart. It's a scary tale. It really is. Way you keep your kids in line, I guess. But a lot of religions do that, don't you? Now, 5 times in the text, the Bible tells us that Pharaoh stiffened, hardened, strengthened his own heart. Now this says in Exodus 4 verse 21 that God will stiffen Pharaoh's heart, but he doesn't do it right off the bat. Nor is Moses to say this thing about killing the firstborn. Now go with me to chapter 10 verse 1 of Exodus. Exodus 10:1. And this is the beginning of our reading today. Then Jehovah said to Moses, Bo el Paro, go to Pharaoh, For I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his courtiers, in order that I may display these signs, my signs, among them, and so forth and so on. This is the first time where God says, I did that to his heart. He says he's going to do it in Exodus 4. What Moses and Aaron meet is an obstinate, unwilling to bend Pharaoh who says, I don't know Jehovah. I don't know what you're asking. You are not going to leave. You're not. And he kept resisting. And he hardens his heart. And then ultimately God says, that's what you've decided. Now I'm stepping in. The time has come. The time has come then to bring about the final plague. The criteria have been met. The conditions of chapter 4 have been met. Now we're going to read chapter 11 and verse 1. And Jehovah said to Moses, I will bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. In other words, it's not going to be a reluctant, okay, you can go. It's going to be, he's going to drive you out. Now, the next reading, by the way, is called Beshalach. In his sending them out, it's a shooing, basically. Get out. You take your animals, your wife, your kids, your dogs, your chickens, they all were there when you left. Get out. That's an old Army cadence that just came back to me. You know, it's funny how that stuff happens. Now, it says, he will drive you out. Now, go back to chapter 6 and verse 1. Chapter 6, verse 1. And Jehovah said to Moses, you shall soon see what I will do to Pharaoh. He will let you go because of a greater might. Indeed, because of a greater might, he will drive them from his land. So Moses gets a little bit discouraged. You know, he goes out, he does what God tells him. He goes with Aaron to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go, or this and this and this is going to happen. And Pharaoh says, bring it. It happens. Moses goes to God. He's like, this is getting worse. And God's reaffirming here in Exodus 6, you're going to see. You're going to see. Not only is he going to let you go, I'm going to send him. He's going to drive you out. And by the way, I've taught this many years now. I translate, shalakatami is the phrase that occurs over and over and over in the Exodus story. And it's typically translated as a jussive, as let my people go. Like you go into Pharaoh and you say, let my people go. But I see shalakatami is send forth my people. So I see it more forceful. Like he tells Pharaoh, you better send my people forth. Because remember, what this is it's a battle between who you're going to serve. You got to serve somebody. It might be the devil, it might be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Bob Dylan. Now, what we've got here is a battle for whose servant these people will be. Who will the people of Israel serve? Will it be Pharaoh, and the gods of Egypt, or will it be Jehovah? That's the story. Now, I want you to look in Exodus 11, and I want us to pick up. He just says to Moses that he's going to put this final plague on Pharaoh and Egypt. Look down at verse 4. Moses said, thus says Jehovah, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians. And every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as never has been or ever will be again. Not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at a man or beast, in order that you may know that Jehovah makes a distinction between Israel or Egypt and Israel. Now, one of the key points, not only in the Exodus story, but in the Hebrew Bible, is that God intends to make a distinction between Israel and others, right? Now, a person can always join Israel, but this chosen group is set up for distinction. Quite often, those opposed are set up for extinction. So you have distinction versus extinction. You have God chooses, and others who choose not to be part of that are taken out of the scenario. Now, I believe that what we read here in Exodus 11 is a fulfillment, if you will, of what was said in Exodus 4, verses 21 through 23. Remember, most people miss this. Exodus 4, 21 through 23, I've even taught in the past. God told Moses to go say this to Pharaoh, and he doesn't. He goes in and he argues with him back and forth, but he was supposed to say this when he went to Egypt. But I wasn't reading closely. Now I see you're to go say this about the firstborn dying, but don't say it until I've hardened his heart. Well, that doesn't happen until 10:1. Perfect. It works. See what happens when we read? Now, it's come down to this, firstborn versus firstborn. Now look at verse 8, just because I want to catch this part. Then all the courtiers of yours, Moses is talking, shall come down to me and bow low to me, saying, depart you and all the people you follow, or who follow you, and after that I will depart. And he left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. How many of you have ever noticed where Moses says, when this is done, you are going to bow to me, and you're going to send me forth? Now, I know what you're thinking. No, he's speaking for God there. Read it. All right. So Moses is hot and angered. He tells him, you're going to bow low to me. You're going to tell me to depart and all the people who follow you. Imagine Moses putting his finger in Pharaoh's face and saying, let me tell you how this is going to go down. You and all these people are going to bow to me, send me forth, and then he just walks out and slams the door behind him. Now, it is interesting when we talk about textual variants. The Bible as we have it, our Tanakh, our Old Testament, if a person is from a Christian background or has a Christian Bible, is based upon the Masoretic text, which has been firm for quite some time. But what we know from a study of biblical text, there are variations. We see quite a bit in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see quite a bit when we compare the Masoretic text to the Septuagint. And a lot of people say, well, you shouldn't trust the Septuagint. Well, I don't know. It's not so easy because the Septuagint often agrees with Dead Sea Scroll readings, which are earlier than the Masoretic text. We're talking, 9th century, 10th century A.D. as far as the oldest copy we have. But when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're going back, 100 BCE maybe. Often the Hebrew there in that text, which has a text that matches the Hebrew Bible, matches closer to the Septuagint. All right? So we do have variations in the text. Now this brings me to my interesting observation. It is interesting to note that the Samaritan Pentateuch has something of a variation here in chapter 11. Samaritan Pentateuch has Moses clearly quoting what he was told in Exodus 4 to say to Pharaoh. So my point is, I connect Exodus 4 with Exodus 11. Now we'll tell you this, The Samaritan Pentateuch, one thing that we know from studying it is that it often adds things, smooths things out. I know a lot of people want to believe that it's a more ancient text, but the Samaritan text is something which shows signs of, how do we say, conforming to make sense out of something. In other words, it adds things if it's sort of unclear. But this is interesting that it inserts Exodus 4:22 and 23 here, because if you think about it, that's the perfect place for it. Even without it, Exodus 11, where Moses tells Pharaoh this plague is coming, he's clearly fulfilling what he was told to say in Exodus 4. It's the perfect place to put it in if it would have been placed in there. Now, the theme that I mentioned earlier about a distinction between Israel and Egypt is something which shows up throughout the narratives about the Exodus. Basically, we're talking about, we've got a battle going on. The son, God's firstborn son, or Pharaoh and Egypt's firstborn son. It's going to be a trade-off. One or the other. This is the distinction that's going to be made. Now look at chapter 11 again, and let's see, 11 verse 6 and 7. Yeah, the distinction. Okay. There should be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as never been or ever will be again, and not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites. By the way, that's a whole other argument. How do you translate that? At man or beast, in order that you may know that Jehovah makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. This is throughout the text. Go back with me to chapter 8, Exodus 8, and verse 18, or verse 22 in an English Bible or a Christian Bible. 8:18, 8:22. But on that day I will set apart the region of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of insects shall be there, that you may know that I, Jehovah, am in the midst of the land of Egypt, or the land, and I will make a distinction between my people and your people. Tomorrow this shall come to pass, this sign. See that? A distinction. Havoc is going to be unleashed on the people of Egypt, but not on my people. And the reason, God says, I'm going to show you there's a distinction between what's mine and what's yours. All of this is going to cause Pharaoh to send forth God's people. Now look at chapter 9 and verse 4. This is the plague of the livestock. Verse 4 and 9. But the Lord, Jehovah, will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of the Egyptians, so that nothing shall die of all that belongs to the Israelites. You see that, the distinction? Look at and then 11:7 has it too. Now the Hebrew word for distinction is pe lamed he, and it means a separation. So there's going to be a separation. You're going to see it. You're going to see between what happens to them versus what happens to you. Now, it's not always, that distinction is shown throughout the Exodus narrative, even when the word pe lamed he is not used. I'll give you an example. Look at the story in chapter 10, I think it's verse 21, of the darkness. 10:21. Let's see if that's right. Yes. In 10:21, then Jehovah said to Moses, hold out your arm toward the sky, that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched or felt. Moses held out his arm toward the sky, and thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another, and for 3 days no one could get up from where he was. but all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings. You see the distinction? Imagine if have you ever seen the world map, like at night, the globe? See, I'm doing that. I know some people are going to say, well, the world's flat. But listen, you know how the picture, whether NASA distorts it or not, is you pass along the dark side of the globe, and as you get to like North Korea, it's totally dark and everything around it is lit up. You ever seen that? Look it up. It's interesting. This is the idea I get in my mind. It's like the light, it's sort of reversed. So it's a pocket, Goshen. How big is Goshen? We're going to talk about that. How big of an area is being populated by this group of Israelites? We're going to consider that. But they had light, and the rest of Egypt is sitting in darkness. Okay, next question we entertain. Who kills all the firstborn? Who does it? Who's wielding the sword, or however? You know, some of the movies show some sort of like gaseous substance sneaking up, and it only affects the firstborn, and some have a angel of death coming through, whacking. We don't get a lot of details in that. But the question becomes, was it Jehovah or an angel of evil? Evil, a messenger of evil, a sending of messengers of evil. Is it more than one? I mean, this is the whole land of Egypt. All the firstborn have to be killed. How's it done? Is it a bunch of bad angels running through? This disagreement, by the way, this debate, because there are people who side on both sides of this debate, but this debate goes into the Talmud. I mean, they're discussing it back and forth, and even there is in the Haggadah, the story, you know, to tell the story of the Passover, they repeat a midrash that sort of tries to push the angel image out of your mind. It's part of this debate, right? It's clearly trying to fight this. And the reason is because there are seemingly some contradictions in our sources. Look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 23. Exodus 12:23. And it says, "For when Jehovah goes through to smite the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts, and Jehovah will pass over," this is the translation here, will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your home. Who's doing the whacking here, the killing? Is it Jehovah, or is it the destroyer? Or is the destroyer actually in the text? What are we dealing with here? Now look at Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12. "For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I will mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt. I, Jehovah." Who's it sound like he's doing it there? Now you might say, well, he's doing it through the agency of the Malachai Ra'im. Okay, could be. I just want to point this out. Look at verse 27 of chapter 12. "You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to Jehovah, because he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our houses." By the way, there's a big debate over what Pesach means. Pesach means. We're going to get to that in a moment as well. Look at verse 29. "In the middle of the night, Jehovah struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle." Who struck who? Who's striking them down? You see how there's a debate? Now, the angel of death, which is made popular in film and media, that phrase doesn't occur in our narratives. You say, well, there is that story in Kings, there's this. I'm talking about Exodus. Who is it? And the main point of this plague, again, is that a distinction is being made between God's firstborn son and the firstborn son of Egypt. Firstborn versus firstborn of Jehovah. Now, chapter 13 of Exodus is devoted in large part to showing this distinction. The firstborn of Egypt is killed, and the firstborn of the Israelites, which are the firstborn of Jehovah, are spared, redeemed. Chapter 13 deals with the redemption of the firstborn, and it's directly tied to what happens on this fateful night, the night of this plague. In fact, we'll look at that in just a moment. Now let's look at it now. Exodus 13 and 15. Let me go ahead and show you this. Exodus 13, 15. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, Jehovah slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both man and beast. Therefore, I sacrifice to Jehovah every first male issue of the womb, but redeem every firstborn among my sons. So this text deals with the redemption of the firstborn. This is the core point of the Exodus, what is popularly known as Passover. The story is told to eager-eyed children around a table. It raises questions sometimes, you know. So God killed all those people? It's an interesting story, right? You're like, yes, honey, eat your horseradish. Sorry. Exodus chapter 11. The communication by Moses to Pharaoh of this final plague seems to be, in a way, interrupted by chapter 12, verses 1 through 28. Those are the details of the Passover, okay? And the reason I say interrupted, it's because chapter 11, verses 1, you know, the first 10 verses or so, are telling about the final plague. And then chapter 11 seems kind of short, doesn't it? Look in your Bible, it's just pretty short. And then chapter 12 is inserted there. I say inserted there. I think it's the way that the sources were put together, and I'll show you why I say that. Chapter 12 deals with the Passover, but it's in and of itself. Careful study has brought this up. You ever wonder why different religious groups, even within Judaism and without Judaism, and people on Facebook fight over festivals, and no, it's the 15th, no, it's the 14th, no, it was this, it was that. You know why that is? It's because the texts are very difficult. It's because we have, in one place, it'll say one thing, and in another, it doesn't quite line up, and so people are citing their position based on a certain text with prominence. They're putting that one to the top. The reason I'm bringing this up is because if you skip over, just for the time being, just to get this point, you go from 11, where he's talking about the last plague, then you get the whole story of Passover, and then verse 29. If you skip to verse 29, Exodus chapter 12, verse 29. And it picks back up. Past tense. In the middle of the night, Jehovah struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh arose in the night with all his courtiers and all the Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Up, depart from among my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go serve Jehovah as you said." Very important. Verse 32, "Take also your flocks, your herds, as you said, and be gone. And may you bring a blessing upon me also." This is followed by an urging on behalf of the Egyptian populace to the Israelites to leave with great wealth. Remember, this goes back to Genesis 15, where God tells Abraham, your descendants are going to be in Egypt, and they're going to go out in the fourth generation with great wealth. All right? So this idea is shown in the text to have happened. They give them clothing, silver, gold, and verse 36 says, "And the Lord had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their request. Thus they stripped the Egyptians." Okay. Now, look at verse 31 again. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Up, depart from among my people, you, the Israelites, with you. Go worship Jehovah." Literally in Hebrew, it's serve. Serve Jehovah as you said. Go as you've said. How has he said he's going to go? That's the question. What does that mean? Does Pharaoh think that he's going forever? This is a question. This is a debate. Does Pharaoh, now you might say, well, you know he wants him gone forever after what just happened. Does he or doesn't he? Here's what he has said so far. Let's go through them quickly. Exodus 3:18, they will listen to you. "You shall go with the elders of Israel to the king of Egypt and say to him, Jehovah, the God of Hebrews, manifested himself to us. Now therefore let us go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to Jehovah our God." We're going for 3 days. This is what he's been asking for. Let us go 3 days. We're going to go to the wilderness. We're going to worship Jehovah. Look at chapter 5, verse 3. Chapter 5, verse 3. They said, "The God of the Hebrews has manifested himself to us. Let us go, we pray, a distance of 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice to Jehovah our God, lest he strike us with pestilence or sword." Remember, that's where the Pharaoh says, "I don't know your God. I'm not letting you go." They just want 3 days off. And remember, we have text from biblical period where the Pharaoh Egyptians were grant workers holidays, like union contract. You know, we get off on New Year's, Christmas, whatever. They would go and get these holidays. Not those, but you know. Now, look at chapter 8, verse 23. Let's see. He's asked consistently. Verse 23, 27 in an English Bible, 8:23 or 27. "So we must go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness and sacrifice to Jehovah our God as he may command us." All right? So plenty of other texts aren't as specific. There are plenty of texts where it just says, let us go to serve God in the wilderness. Let us go serve God in the wilderness. But Pharaoh's words are heeded when he says, go out. And let's look now at chapter 12, verse 37 through 39. "The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children. Moreover, a mixed multitude went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves." Now, leaving alone for a moment the anachronism of Ramesses, remember the name Ramesses comes in later. It's like 12th century. I think the Exodus is well before that. But leaving that aside, we do see that Numbers 33 suffers from the same anachronism, but it too has the route goes from what's called Ramesses to Sukkot. Now, it could be, and this is what I believe that that's a later edit. We don't know who did the edit. People have ideas, speculation, but we don't know who updated the text. We don't know what group did it. We just know that it was changed. The question is, how many people are leaving Egypt? And I want you to get a picture of this. Here it says 600,000. 600,000 men on foot. 600,000. Look at Numbers. Go with me to the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 11, verse 21. We're going to do some horizontal work here quickly. 11:21. Moses said, "The people who are with me number 600,000 men. Yet you say, I will give them enough meat to eat for a whole month." So that confirms at least. Now, look at Numbers chapter 1, verse 46. Now, we're starting to get into what I really like, and we're going to get into the Exodus itself and the wilderness itineraries. So this is important that we get some facts. So Numbers chapter 1, verse 46, all who were enrolled came to 603,550. Okay? Now, you could say, well, the other two are just rough estimates, 600,000. And that's fair enough. We have Exodus 12, we have Numbers 11, both say 600,000. I'm okay. Here, Numbers 146, 603,550. Remember that. Remember that. Look at chapter 2, verse 32 of Numbers. Numbers 2:32. Those are the enrollments of the Israelites by ancestral houses. The total enrolled in the divisions for all troops, 603,550. Okay? By the way, that's a lot. And that's only the men. That's only the men. Specifically, men 20 years old and older, if you look at Exodus 38, verse 26, or Numbers chapter 1, verse 46 and 47, talks about the counting age. You just count the ones that are 20 and older. Men of war. This is 603,550 men, 20 and older. Now, to this number, Numbers chapter 3, verse 39 adds 22,000 Levites. So now we're at 625,550 men, 20 and older. Okay? Don't forget, we've got the mixed multitude, and we don't have any idea how many of those there were. We don't have a number. The text doesn't give it. All told, with women, children, and people that aren't fighting age, we're looking at, let's say, conservative number is 2.5 million, upwards of 3 or more million people. Now, I want you to get this idea in your head, because I want you to think about this. The population, because people read those numbers and they just read over them and they don't pay any attention. They just say, well, it says it in the Word of God, and I just want you to hold up just a minute. Think. Chicago, 2020 census. We have that data. I don't have 2021, I have 2020. Chicago is 2.75 million people. That, by the way, is probably about what we're talking about here. 2.6. Everybody in Chicago and their animals and the zoo and everything. Everything. Now, Chicago, if you look at the city, the land, we're talking 227 miles in which, you're talking about Chicago, 227 miles has within it 2.75 million people. Or if you use the metric system, 590 kilometers is the size of Chicago. Now that's a density, I've got this in my notes, that's a density, people per area, 12.6 thousand in each of these miles. 12.6 thousand in a mile to get that population spread. Or 4,650 kilometers. In a kilometer, I'm sorry. Now, Houston is 2.3 million. Everybody, 2020 count. Houston is 2.3, a little less than Chicago, and it's twice the area, 640 square miles, 1,650 square kilometers. Density. I mean, whenever you read these numbers, what does it take to put 2.75 million people? Let's say they're close together. Chicago. That's a pretty good picture. Now the question is, can you take Chicago and the 2.75 million inhabitants and put that on a map in Goshen? I encourage you to look at that. Think about that. It is such a problem that people have looked at this very clearly, trying to figure out, what does the text really mean? One of the proposals is that Aleph, which can be translated thousand, is really better translated as clan. So you have, so many clans and not hundreds of thousands. If clan equals thousand, then you have a little bit smaller group. Now that's one proposal. But I don't know. Look at Exodus 38. I don't think the Bible wants you to go that route. If you look at least the writer of Exodus 38, let's look at this. I looked at all these verses to try to figure out. All right, 38:24. All the gold that was used for the work in all the work of the sanctuary, the elevation offering of gold, came to 29 talents, 730 shekels by the sanctuary weight. The silver of those of the community who were recorded came to 100 talents and 1,775 shekels by the sanctuary weight, a half shekel a head, half a shekel by the sanctuary weight for each one who was entered in the records from age of 20 years or up, 603,550 men. So if you do it's suggesting that this is talking about not clans, but people. Now, I just want people to realize, whether or not you accept the literal number or you think maybe this is hyperbole, exaggeration, it could, whatever you decide, I just want you to have an accurate picture. We're talking about moving Chicago through the wilderness. Now, think about this. If you're on the east side of Chicago and you start walking, how long will it be before the people on the west side of Chicago get out of Egypt? If you're on the east side of a column, you figure out the width. Say it's 100 wide, 200 wide, make it 1,000. You're walking through a sea. How long will it be from the time the first one goes through until the guy on the west side goes through? We have to think about these things. Imagine if you're in a camp, 2.75 million, and you're in the middle of the camp and you learn the rule that you have to go to the restroom outside the camp. You see what I'm saying? We have to think about these things. We have to be honest brokers. We have to be honest to Moses. We have to look at these and say, what makes the most sense? Okay. Now this event, the Exodus event, is called in Deuteronomy this great thing. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 32. You have but to inquire about bygone ages that came before you. Ever since God created man on earth, from one end of heaven to the other, has anything as grand as this ever happened, or has its like ever been known? Has anyone ever heard the voice of a God speaking out of fire as you have and survived? Or has any God ventured to go and take for himself one nation from the midst of another by prodigious acts, by signs and portents, by war, by a mighty and outstretched arm, and an awesome power, as Jehovah your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? This great thing, the Exodus, the departure, the moving of a people group out of Egypt through the wilderness. We're going to follow the wilderness itineraries. Now, a lot of people, I don't want you to be nervous because a lot of people have been told not to think for themselves. Apologists have gone out of their way to take the difficulties off the table for you. And when somebody says, it says 603,550 males 20 and older, I believe it. My question to you is, have you ever considered what that looks like when you put those people in the desert? When you put those people walking through the sea? I mean, look, there are these movies that show the great CGI stuff and, you know, the wall of water at the Gulf of Aqaba splitting open, and, you know, those are real cool until you think about it and you say, that doesn't do it justice. If you have 2.75 million people, how long does it take to move them this far? And if the water is 200 feet deep there, or 1,000, or, you know, people have to think about these things. We're going to think about these things. We're going to look at these things very closely, and we're going to make sense of it as best we can. We're going to determine what the text says. We're going to see if there's a way to make it through these things and truly understand the picture that's being demonstrated for us by these texts. Next week, we'll pick up with yet another chapter in this great thing. Don't miss it. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. See you next week.